Dr. Dan's Freedom Forum is on the air. Dr. Dan's Freedom Forum is on the air. Never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. Dr. Dan's Freedom Forum is a call to arms for those American patriots who, in the tradition of our founding fathers, will stand up now to defend the Constitution and the liberties that it guarantees to each citizen, to each of us. That is our mission, to explain in a clear and concise manner the direct effect of each issue on the individual, on you personally, not some anonymous being in a distant place, and to define in no uncertain terms the consequences of inaction. Let the battle begin.
Well, hello, this is Dr. Dan. If you live in the woods, if you do live in the woods, the last thing you want to hear about is wildfire. That's for sure. Wildfire could mean the loss of your home, your possessions, your barn, animals, vehicles, and even possibly your life and the lives of your loved ones. In case of wildfire, you would like to believe that the government agencies assigned to suppress and put out the fires are trained, equipped, and motivated to extinguish the blaze before it comes too close to your home. Unfortunately, that may not be the case under previous administrations, especially those that were seeking to drastically increase the amount of American land owned by the government, the so-called 30 by 30 agenda. If you are familiar with the Constitution, you know that the feds are allowed to own 10 square miles for governmental headquarters, that is Washington, D.C. Under the necessary and proper clause, the federal government may acquire and retain land necessary for carrying out its enumerated powers. Article 1, Section 8, of course. That includes parcels for military bases, post offices, buildings to house federal employees, and so forth. In many states out west, the feds have grossly exceeded their constitutional limits. Enter the U.S. Forest Service. Their job is to manage federal lands for the benefit of we the people. Nevertheless, they have demonstrated a complete lack of ability to manage federal lands, allowing fallen trees and erosion to block access roads, preventing the timber industry from harvesting timber, and trying to declare large areas of wilderness so they can keep people out and let it deteriorate without proper management. Unmanaged forest land is a major wildfire risk. Fire requires heat, oxygen, and fuel. All that timber lying on the ground is fuel for wildfires. Even worse, it turns out that in recent years, the U.S. Forest Service has instituted a program of using fire to steal private land by making it inhabitable, even to the point of letting wildfires burn out of control and actually setting forest areas on fire. The results have been a disaster for people, like you and me. People have been losing their homes, farms, livestock, grazing lands, and their lives. So now we have the Haoe wildfire in my neighboring county, Graham County, North Carolina. It started as a lightning strike, but is still very minimally contained as of several days ago. So I have invited my friend. Yes, I have invited my friend, Frank Carroll of Wildlife Pros, to join us to discuss this. Frank Carroll of Wildlife Pros, welcome as a guest on Dr. Dan's Freedom Forum Live.
Dr. Dan, it's great to be with you today. I'm glad to speak with you.
Well, the Haoe wildfire began as a lightning strike. Why don't you tell us, what do you think happened after that?
Well, I believe that from their early press releases and their current discussion, that they're using this fire in a what they call a full suppression mode, but it's actually a sort of a contained and what I call loose herd situation. They've been actively burning between Santilla, the Santilla Creek and Little Santilla Creek and the Pine Ridge Road, and they were burning quite actively yesterday before the rain started, and they actually burned a finger of the fire down to the road with the purpose and intent of lighting off the entire hillside to the north of the Pine Ridge Road, quite a lot of acreage in there, and but that was stymied by Mother Nature. When the Lord decides to rain on your parade, he does a thorough job. It started raining yesterday afternoon. It rained through the night, and it's extremely hard to get anything to burn in the rain, which is positive for everybody.
So tell me, Frank, I mean, you've said that they brought the fire, they allowed the fire to burn down to the road. To me, it would, well, I would think that the road might be an access point to get in and actually fight the fire. What purpose do you think they had for doing that?
Well, so it's called, what they're doing now is called an indirect firefight, meaning that instead of going in and sending hand crews along the fire edge, what we call 1 foot in the black, where you have 1 foot in the black and 1 foot in the green, and you cut fire line and you stop, you take any vegetation and burnable material away from the fire so it can no longer burn. They're down on the roads, and they didn't allow the fire to burn to the road. They lit the road on fire. And what they do is in their jargon, this is called a prepared fire line, the road or a lake shore, or it could even be an air tanker drop. And they light the edge of their prepared fire line, in this case the road, the Pine Ridge Road. They light it on fire, and the idea is to burn many hundreds of acres between the road and the main fire. In the past, this would have been a tactic that what we called indirect attack in the old days, was falling back to the next best ridge because the fire was too hot to handle, and firefighters couldn't really get to the edge of the fire safely, and so they fell back to the next best ridge. They prepared fire lines, and then they lit it on fire to rob the fire of fuel as it proceeded. In this case, they're what I call playing with fire. They're using this fire for natural resource purposes. They don't say that. What they say is that they're for firefighter safety and various reasons, they're doing these, what they call firing operations, where they use fire extensively to reintroduce fire to fire depleted ecosystems. And a quick perusal of the map of the area and the memorial forest and so on, the Joyce Kilmer Memorial Forest Area and Wilderness, etc. There's been a lot of fire in that country over the years. And so this is burning for the sake of burning for natural resource purposes, trying to continue to reintroduce fire, in their view, into these what they call fire depleted ecosystems. And so they're actively using emergency fire suppression money to burn a lot of country on purpose. And that might be wise. It might actually be a good thing in this case. The problem is it's often not a good thing. Plus, it's in a sense it's gaslighting the public. You can't, in my view, it's unfair and untruthful to call a fire a full suppression fire, meaning you're going to get in and put the fire out, and then have it squirrel around for 11 or 12 days while you light stuff on fire in between rainstorms. Just looking at, we have some tremendous maps. Pound Fire Mapper, the pound sign Fire Mapper, is ArcGIS's almost real-time coverage of active wildfires. And looking at it, that fire is deader than a doornail. You couldn't light a cigarette on that fire at the moment. And so hopefully they'll keep it that way. What we've seen in the past, though, is they'll wait for a drying trend and then they'll continue to try to light it. And that's unfortunate because they're using congressionally appropriated emergency fire suppression money, which is specifically appropriated to go put the fire out, not to play with fire. And so this is not a very dramatic example of what happens when they do play with fire. There have been many Western examples where they lit 600,000 acres on fire over the course of the Dixie Fire, or where they managed to burn 194,000 acres of spectacular California forest in one afternoon on September 9th, 2020. Many, many examples. But this is a fair discussion point because even on the in your part of the country, in the Carolinas and so on, where fire is not as common as it is in the West, but it is common, they're using the same tactics. It's a universal approach to burning federal land and, unfortunately, quite often private property in the interests of whatever the new religion is about ecosystem management in the agency.
Well, it's very interesting what you've said. And what they're doing is a fire started naturally, and then they use that as an excuse to extend it and burn property. It happens to be Forest Service property right now for the most part. But look at us right next to the Joyce Kilmer Forest, a very major tourist attraction in the area, as well as Santitla Lake, which is another big recreation draw. And there are a lot of things in that area which draw people for recreation and tourism. And here you have a fire that probably could have been put out pretty simply. They just let it burn until it gets bigger and bigger. I think they're going to be foiled. There's going to be about 5 days of rain. That'll make it pretty difficult to restart it. But it's kind of a ruse, isn't it? They have a fire and they use it as a ruse. They say, oh, yeah, we're trying to put it out. Meanwhile, they're letting it get bigger or even making it bigger.
Over the past decade, the Forest Service and other federal agencies, but none of them to the extent, other federal land management agencies, none of them to the extent that the Forest Service have hit on this idea that active forest management now is principally a matter of fire. And so they're using fire to manage everything from yellow-legged frogs in California to the redwoods to this area in the Joyce Kilmer country that you're talking about that's so beautiful, under the theory that if we can reestablish light burning and, sort of a prescribed fire situation in a wildfire context, that somehow that's going to be good for the environment overall. And in this case, it might be. But there's so many problems with it. It's not legally sanctioned. It's not an authorized use of congressionally appropriated dollars. There's nothing in the Forest Service Organic Act or the National Forest Management Act that authorizes the Forest Service to use fire as a management tool. It authorizes timber cutting, it authorizes grazing and maintaining watersheds for clean water and clean air and all of these many things. Fire is not one of them. And so there are many reasons why this has happened. The environmental community managed to box the Forest Service into a corner starting in 1980 using a good faith effort on the part of the agency to do rational planning, which involved the public. And the Forest Service went out to everybody and said, what do you think we ought to do here? We should cut some timber and graze cows and all these different things. And the environmentalists used that issue by issue to stop the Forest Service from any kind of sensible, common sense management, cutting trees and other things that are there for our use and our good, and were purposefully set aside for those purposes. And now they've been boxed into the corner that the only management tool that they can use without anybody's permission, without public comment, without any oversight of any kind, is fire. And so when these fire teams and line officers of the Forest Service get together and they have a fire like this, they almost universally now decide to use it for purposes other than and use their troops and our money, our tax money, for purposes other than putting out the fire. The reason you and I give the Forest Service money where fire control is concerned is to go put out the damn fire, not to light more. There are hundreds of firefighters, heavy equipment, aircraft, committed to this fire, which has now become a prescribed fire. The difference between this fire and a prescribed fire is that a prescribed fire requires a burn plan, and it requires signatures from various levels of the agency, and it has to meet certain smoke management guidelines, and it has to meet all kinds of what we call prescriptions related to the how the fire is lit and how it burns and so on. And in this case, none of that applies. They're I think of them as freebooters. They're a burning team, and their whole purpose is to go out and set stuff on fire. And again, in this case, it may be a net benefit to the environment, but it's not done under any legal auspices. And the problem is, if there's a few days of drying trend, and they have not gone in and created direct fire line, and the fire gets up and moves, just like the fire at Gatlinburg several years ago that killed 80 people and burned hundreds of houses and private property under a similar sort of quote natural fire management regime with the Park Service. When that happens, they have no responsibility. They have no fiscal responsibility, fiduciary responsibility for our resources. They have no mechanisms in these agencies to pay the people who are the victims of this kind of policy. And there's no way to take them to court about it. Of course, we can file tort claims. And at Gatlinburg, I think 500 people filed tort claims alleging that the Forest Service acted in a way that harmed them. And the only other avenue that's open is the inverse condemnation. So if Dr. Dan, they decide that where you're sitting right now and make an excellent highway interchange, they can take that land away from you and throw your studio out and run you out of town, make you move to Alabama or whatever. But they have to pay you at least the market value for seizing your land for government purposes. But in the case where the Forest Service and other agencies decide to light land on fire, including our public lands, and then as a result of that, they also burn a lot of private property and so on, they're under no obligation to pay that. And you have to prove that they did what they meant to do, and in doing so, they seized your private property by burning. And it's an egregious long-term thing. It takes 4 years to 6 or 8 years to find some kind of resolution monetarily to those things. So it's one of the most egregious cases of overreach in federal agencies that I'm aware of. On the other hand, the world suddenly changed on November 5th last year. And that change is coming home to roost for these agencies. And the reason it is because people have been so offended and so affected by these kinds of unilateral fire policies that the reaction has been perhaps an overreaction, but a justifiable and just reaction nonetheless, which is now they're going to fight fire fast is the new byword. an executive order from President Trump is going to probably combine the federal firefighters under one roof, which I have mixed emotions about, but I understand its genesis. And then it's also going to require the government to attack fires and put them out immediately. And so it's a sea change for these agencies. It's going to hit some harder than others. In almost none of these cases are the firefighters to blame. This is not a bunch of rogue firefighters, although that does happen. Lighting the country on fire on their own recognizance. This is a case of purposeful, intentional agency policy that's having profound effects and impacts on people in America. For example, in 2022 in New Mexico, firefighters, through escape prescribed fires that were not properly taken care of, followed up by expanding large fires that were the result of escape prescribed fires, and then doing huge firing operations to make these fires even bigger, lighting fire 10 miles away from the edge of the fire, and to try to burn the entire Aldo Leopold wilderness because it hadn't been burned for a long time. They thought it was a good idea. These things have come home to roost, and so there's so much chaos and uncertainty now in the agency that I'll be surprised if they can manage to do anything but follow what we used to call the 10 a.m. rule, which is you'll fight these fires with the intention of putting them out by 10 a.m. the next morning. And if you don't get it by 10 a.m. the next morning, you'll fight this fire hammer and tong until you put it out at 10 a.m. the next morning. And so there's I feel sorry for firefighters. They're in this strange twilight of political anger and a sense of being fed up across the country by government regulation, government overreach that results in these profound impacts to people and their property. And so it's a net benefit, I believe, although it's going to be a very difficult transition over the next few years.
Frank, you've talked about a number of things which I think we should look at a little bit in greater detail. As a result of some of these fires out west, one of the ways that the Forest Service and FEMA and the rest of the government agencies, what they were doing was trying to use fire and lands that were burned as an excuse to create what they called fire areas, or fire areas where fires were likely to occur, with the hope that then it would be impossible for people to rebuild in those areas because they couldn't get building permits, they couldn't get insurance and things like that. That is a very dangerous thing. We have the same thing here. Of course, after the hurricane, FEMA has come in and tried to designate areas as flood zones that have never had a flood, except this one big hurricane came through. And yeah, there was a flood because, millions of gallons of water were suddenly dumped in one place at one time. Well, that's not a flood zone. That's a natural disaster that occurs every once in a while. And forest fires are the same thing. Why should people lose the right to rebuild and to own their property and use their property just because once they had a fire there, which most of the time the Forest Service was the one who started it in the first place and it got out of control?
There's very, very strong evidence for what you're saying. Various, what I call activist agency personnel, but also activists in the environmental community in particular, have long argued for what I call Turtle Island, which is this idea of stitching together the last best wild places in America in a way that allows for the free flow of animals and so on, unencumbered by human beings. And it's this odd construction that these people have, what I think of as a religion, which says that human beings don't have any role in the environment. It's as though suddenly we were dropped here on this planet as an alien force, and we've been messing with things ever since. And that nothing could be further from the truth. this is our planet. We are animals on this planet. We're human beings with bodies and spirits, and we have interacted with everything on this planet to the same extent as any other type of life on Earth from the very beginning. And the Earth abides. The Earth is fabulously capable of fending for itself. When there's it was kind of a joke, but it wasn't funny. During the Exxon Valdez oil spill in Alaska a number of years ago, crews were getting paid fabulous amounts of money, individual Alaska people with boats and nets and stuff and so on, to go out and try to capture this oil that spilled out of the Exxon Valdez. And they were having to race to get it done because the oil was finding its way back in through the sands and back into the earth, because the earth knows how to take care of an oil spill. And so people were panicked because their money was being cut off, because they found themselves unable to get to the oil that they were supposed to pick up. And so we have a similar situation with wildfire, except that the independent factor that's so troubling to many of us is the purposeful lighting of these fires. I mentioned earlier the 2020 North Complex, where 194,000 acres burned in one afternoon as a result of widespread firing operations. 16 people and their entire community of Berry Creek were killed, burned over, community completely destroyed. I was just back there in June to Berry Creek, and another friend of mine, Nadine Bailey, was just there a few weeks ago. And that community is utterly bereft. It's almost impossible for them to get aid and assistance. Many people are living out of, old vans and RVs and so on, whatever they can find. And so there's a very strong case for what you're saying, that this is purposeful policy on the part of the government, but also on the part of environmental activists who will not allow salvage logging. And that may change also, because the government in previous administrations has been unwilling to support decisions to do salvage logging. President Trump is going to pull out all the stops to make sure that when our valuable public timber, which is your and my property, that's our property, that's our timber, when it's burned and killed, it's going to be salvaged as quickly as possible. And so again, the pendulum under President Trump is swinging so fast that people are falling off of it left and right, literally and figuratively. And so I don't know what the future has in store. I'm not a prophet, but I'm encouraged, because it's high time that the tide turned. And I believe it's turning. It may not turn for a long time, but it's going to turn for a few years. And so,
if we set a different course, Frank, now, I think in many ways that course will be very difficult to turn around. People understand what's going on. People understand that things have been going wrong. A lot of them do. I don't know if enough do, but certainly a lot of them do. And when things start changing back to a sane and rational way of handling a lot of our problems, I think it might not be a real easy task to all of a sudden turn around and do things which are detrimental and destructive to people's lives, detrimental and destructive to our the American system and the free market economy. So
amen.
I think if we get a good, rapid, and strong train of progress under President Trump, I think it might not be as easy to turn it around as they would like to think.
Yes, and I mean, all of these issues are far more complicated than we can talk about it in a few minutes here this evening. But I mean, the whole insurance picture across the West, the agencies have either purposefully or inadvertently created what they call red-green maps. And they have maps of the national forests and the parks and so on. And some of the areas are shaded green and some are shaded red. And in the red areas, those are considered high risk to major killing wildfires and so on. And the insurance companies took those maps and made wholesale decisions about insurance based on the color red that somebody in an agency someplace decided would look good on that piece of paper. And so, yes, there are thousands of families now who cannot afford and do not have insurance living in the wildlands that's their right to live in, land that they own, land that they, maybe they've had for generations, as in one famous case on the North Complex, a family that's been ranching there for 5 years was utterly burned to the ground. 400 head of cattle killed and everything else. And that's the outcome of this policy for which there's been no recourse. And so, one of the very positive things about President Trump and his administration is that they are taking incredibly, in fact, in some ways, I don't think they're extreme, but they're certainly extremely interesting steps to try to bring some kind of rational behavior back to our society and to the agencies that manage our lands.
Well, I mean, obviously, it's about time that happens. And I think that on November 5th, there were enough people who came to the realization that the direction of the country was wrong, dangerous, and destructive. And they wanted to stop that. The problem, of course, is when Trump makes major changes, they're not going to have a positive effect immediately. It takes time to turn a battleship around. It doesn't turn around on a dime. The ship of state was traveling at very rapid pace to a waterfall. And now we're turning that around, but it's not going to be turned around instantaneously.
Yes, and I think that's true, and it's frustrating. One of the things about this little fire that we're talking about over in your country, I think you said it's the next county over from you,
right?
Is that the fire team and the line officers that are handling management of this fire are apparently oblivious to the criticism that they're using euphemisms and gaslighting and all kinds of other things, inappropriate use of congressionally appropriated dollars, taking action outside of any laws that established the organic acts of the Forest Service and so on, to manage this fire for what they see as good. The problem with it is none of us had any opportunity to help them decide that. We can't even object to what they're doing. There's no process. They don't require a National Environmental Policy Act analysis for this kind of action. They can just literally go do it. And so, and in the West, that's been highly dangerous. In a famous case with the Midnight Sun hotshots and some others, they were turned loose for days to just go light stuff on fire, and they did. And so the impacts of that have also been very profound, and change will be slow. There's entire generations of firefighters. So a generation of firefighters is about 30 years from the first day you fight fire until you're ready to retire. And there's an entire generation now that's been trained and have trained themselves to this notion of using widespread firing operations to manage natural resources and also manage wildfires. And so this case of this little fire we're talking about today, it's probably a textbook case of an easy to fight fire where hand crews could go put a line around it and watch it for a few days and it would be gone. But they're not doing that. They haven't trained themselves to do that. In fact, I don't believe they can remember how to do that quite often. And so they're going to have to, there's a whole bunch of re-education that has to happen. Maybe we ought to ship everybody into a nice national park someplace and spend 6 months re-educating all the fire forces. Unfortunately, unfortunately, we need our brave, smart firefighters. My son-in-law is a squad boss on a hotshot crew, was for 20 years, and a leader on a highly trained hotshot crew. He's one of the most brilliant firefighters I've ever known. Now he's in a senior leadership position, and he knows how to fight fire. He was raised on the in fire crews 20 years ago in Idaho, where people taught firefighters how to cut line and put fires out. But he's also quite adept at lighting fire when he's ordered to. And so there's going to be a lot of consternation in the firefighter ranks. And I'm sorry. Uh, I would hope that firefighters are flexible enough and have and I know they do. They're strong enough to take on whatever the new challenges are. And if the new challenges is fighting and putting out fire, they're going to do it very well, as they did for the last 50 years. So I'm not really worried about firefighters per se, and the deep cuts to the headquarters. This this executive order and also other orders are requiring the head sheds, we call them. You and I were in Washington recently, and we went from these beautiful pillared marble halls, one hall to another, to these great resounding, echoing offices, and we talked to people that were very concerned about stuff, but they had no idea what the hell we were talking about, even though they're in charge of agriculture or the Forest Service or whatever it is. They haven't spent enough time on the ground to understand the effects of their policies. And so for them, it's going to be quite brutal, but also good for us. Much of the overhead structure, the headquarters structure for fire, will move to the west, which is where it belongs. That's where the fires are mostly. And so, it's going to be a time of profound change. And I feel sorry for employees that were caught up in this. I started in fighting fire in 1972, but I began in the Forest Service in 1980, when this rational planning model came, and we started earnestly trying to involve the public in management of their public lands. And I have a unique seat at the table, in the sense that I watched this whole thing come unwound for the last 50 years. It's been 54 years, 55 years, watched it come unwound in a very profound way. And now there's a real opportunity to kind of put part of the genie back in the bottle, and I hope we can get it done. The impact on private property owners cannot be overstated. It's infuriating. It's criminal. In the case of Berry Creek and the 16 civilians that were killed, it's probably a case of criminally negligent homicide. And there's a number of folks that are working now to work with the Butte County Sheriff and see if there are charges that need to be brought. That was very important 6 months ago. Now it may not be so important. It's still important for the people who died, but for the country in general and for the policies that the government was pursuing 6 months ago, that's come to a screeching halt. And so I think there's going to be vast improvement, at least in that area of public land management, and in the security that private property owners may rightly feel in knowing that their government isn't trying to burn them down.
What you said is really, when you get up into the upper echelons of government, these people are so far above and so disconnected from reality. There's no way they can understand an event as tiny as the Haoe fire, or this fire here, that fire there. They are above that. And in terms of hands-on management, many of them have no experience in hands-on management of any of these things. They're political appointees. They get a position because of who they know, not what they know. That's always an issue when it comes to government. Another thing is that it is very difficult to seek redress of grievances. It's very difficult to get standing to sue the government. A very difficult proposition indeed. So
the kings have historically been unwilling to allow people to sue them.
Well, of course,
and so
that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with people who think they are kings, and it's time that we those people who think like that obviously need to be dethroned.
Well, and they need to rejoin all of us, and they need to suffer the same offenses, injuries, and insults, as well as successes and positive things that the rest of us do, so that when they make a decision, it's not based on somebody's whacked out fantasy about how the world is constructed, but it's based on common sense and our core values of private property and individual rights and safety from government overreach and all of these things that are so important to you, Dr. Dan, and to your listeners and to me.
Well, one of the problems, of course, is that the people we're talking about feel entitled to power and feel immune to the consequences of whatever they do, whatever rules and regulations they make. And unfortunately, my view is that they are. There are a lot of people in power and people who have been in power who did some really traitorous things. They were traitors to this country. They have never been prosecuted. They have never been touched. They're leading their wealthy lifestyles and enjoying life. That is really shameful in our country.
Again, there's such a strong sea change that a good portion of the time, my wife and I were laughing about whether we're going to continue to follow the news closely. It's been so exciting and so much fun, but it's also exhausting. There's such a powerful sea change that we're underwater all the time. So I'm very hopeful that real change is coming to at least this aspect of things, where forest rangers can get back to being forest rangers, Smokey Bear can get back to being Smokey Bear, and the federal agencies can get back to being stewards of our shared lands and our resources. I mean, for most of us, America's wildlands or national forests and parks and so on are the only wildlands most of us will ever own. Most of us will never own the kind of country that we're talking about, and we love it. We love our national forests. We love our national parks, and so we should have a say in how they're run. And it shouldn't be up to a small cabal of environmentally, and I hate to use that. The environmentalists call themselves conservationists, but in my view, that's wrong. They're not conservationists. They're the difference between the national parks and the national forests is the national parks are there to be preserved and to be enjoyed in their as close to natural state as possible. The national forests were put there, and we created them for our use as a nation to create wood and watersheds and recreation opportunities and so on. My dad said that the difference between the Park Service and the Forest Service was that the national parks are being held by the Park Service until they can be put into responsible adult hands in the Forest Service. But that's no longer true. Now they're so much like each other that it's hard to tell who's in charge.
Well, we've had an interesting discussion. I want just one question I have really when it comes to the practical nature. We've had 2 fires in our area started by lightning strikes on one tree. How should that have been handled so it didn't turn into a fire?
Smoke jumpers should have jumped in on those fires and put them out. If smoke jumpers were not available because of your situation on the East Coast and so on, hand crews should have marched into those fires and put them out.
Plain and simple, huh?
Well, coming out, so we found out what good firefighters we were coming out of World War II. My dad was an officer. My grandfathers were senior officers, generals, and so on. And coming out of World War II, they immediately applied their war skills to fighting fire. They had trained crews, they had heavy air tankers, they had equipment with tracks on it. They attacked fires just like they did German positions in the Battle of the Bulge, and they put the dang things out. So we know how to do it. Smoke jumpers, in fact, Forest Service smoke jumpers trained the 101st and other air divisions as the war was starting in 1939, 40, 41, on how to jump out of airplanes. The system that they use even today was a Forest Service invention in terms of a static line that you hook onto and you drop out and your chute opens and so on. And so we know how to do this stuff. We have talked ourselves into not thinking it's any longer important, that it's somehow archaic or antique, but it is not. Fires are extremely serious. You mentioned at the top of the program that fires kill, and they do kill. And so it's not enough to say, well, it's okay that they're killing, because, you know, it's really important for us to reintroduce fire to fire depleted ecosystems. No, fires need to be put out. The Congress needs to decide what the law should be related to how fires are handled on the national forests and national parks, not a bunch of people who are serving on fire teams, or, you know, who have a degree from Yale University in ecology or whatever, who've decided in their own little religious tiny bubble that fire is a wonderful thing. The people's laws need to reflect fire policy. And for the first time, I don't know, 30 years or more, we have an opportunity to see that happen.
Fires are really only useful to them because they don't expect to get burned.
Yeah, that's right.
Frank Carroll of Wildfire Pros. By the way, visit their website, wildfirepros.com. Learn about fires, how they should be handled, and a lot of the new innovations and how to protect your home and your property from fire. Frank Carroll, thank you for being guest on Dr. Dan's Freedom Forum Live.
I so appreciate you having me. It was fun to see you in Washington. I look forward to seeing you again soon.
We will, and we'll be talking soon, Frank. Have a great evening. Thank you.
You too.